The city of Atlanta woke beneath a blush of sunrise, the kind that turned every window pane into glass fire. Traffic murmured far below, coffee shops yawned open, and the world seemed ready to begin again. But high above the streets, in a small corner apartment filled with books, paintbrushes, and the scent of lavender tea, Naomi Ellis was already awake, sitting at her desk, tracing sunlight across the edge of a sketchbook. Her pencil moved slowly, hesitantly, sketching the outline of a small brown girl chasing fireflies through a night garden. The page shimmered faintly with color from the rising light. It was one of her favorite things, the fragile hour when dreams still clung to the world, and nothing had yet gone wrong. Naomi drew to remember that softness, because in her real life, the world was not soft. By day, she worked as a children's librarian at a public branch on Peachtree Street, teaching story time, mending torn pages, and listening, always listening, to the quiet music of small voices discovering wonder. By night, she illustrated stories of her own, though she rarely showed them to anyone. It was safer to hide behind the pages than to be seen. She had grown up knowing how invisibility could protect you, but sometimes, on lonely nights when the city hummed too loud, Naomi wondered if being unseen too long could turn a heart to glass. That morning, the migraine came again, a low, merciless throb behind her eyes. It blurred the lines of her sketches until the fireflies became smears of light. She closed the book gently, pressing her palms against her temples. The doctor's appointment she'd avoided for months could no longer wait. She whispered to herself, "I'll call today. I promise." Across the city, in the cool sterility of St. Augustine Medical Center, another soul was already lost in a different kind of silence. Dr. Ethan Blake, 33, had spent the night in the operating theater. His scrubs carried the faint scent of antiseptic and sleeplessness. Under the bright surgical lights, he had held a child's life between his hands, guiding a scalpel through a maze of fragile nerves. Precision was his faith, control his language. The surgery had been a success, at least medically, but even as the team applauded, Ethan felt the familiar emptiness settle inside him. There was always that moment after victory when he wondered why it never felt like enough. He told himself it was exhaustion, or maybe humility, yet deep down, he knew it was something else. The quiet ache of a man who could fix any broken brain, but not the hollowness in his own chest. Outside his office window, the morning sun cut gold through the hospital courtyard. A young mother carried her recovering son past the fountain, both laughing. Ethan's gaze softened briefly before the wall went up again. He had built that wall long ago, after losing his sister Claire to a misdiagnosis that had driven him into medicine and away from joy. He turned back to the stack of patient files on his desk. One name caught his eye. Naomi Ellis, neurological evaluation, Tuesday, 2 p.m. Something about the handwriting, a looped E, a careful precision, stirred him. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was nothing, but a small, unexplainable flicker ran through him, like static before a storm. A chopping of the... That afternoon, the city would conspire to draw two quiet souls into each other's gravity. But for now, they moved separately, unaware that the invisible thread between them had already begun to tighten. Naomi took her morning tea on the balcony, sketchbook open to a clean page. Down below, a jazz musician played his trumpet beside a mural of wings. The melody rose soft and mournful, then soared, filling the street with something close to hope. She began sketching again, not fireflies this time, but a man's silhouette beneath the music, outlined in gold. She didn't know why she drew him that way, tall, distant, eyes hidden. Only that something about the sound reminded her of a heartbeat, finding rhythm after a long silence. She smiled faintly, unaware that miles away, Ethan was sitting at his desk, tapping his pen in perfect sync with that same rhythm. Sometimes life whispers before it shouts. Sometimes two hearts begin to recognize each other long before they meet. Every story begins in quiet moments like these, in small apartments, in sterile hospital corridors, in the space between who we are and who we might become. If this story finds a place in your heart, if you've ever felt invisible or found beauty in the quiet, leave a sign that you're here. A like, a comment, even a single word to remind me you're listening. Because stories, like hearts, need to be heard to keep beating. The light shifted again across Naomi's sketchbook. The girl with the fireflies turned her face toward the dawn, her paper eyes reflecting the promise of something yet unseen. And somewhere across the city, Dr. Ethan Blake looked up from his notes and exhaled for the first time in hours, feeling, without reason, that the day had just changed its direction. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the wind had started to move. The waiting room at St. Augustine Medical Center held the hush of a chapel, the soft shuffle of papers, the rustle of magazines, the thin sigh of the air conditioner like a tired prayer. Naomi Ellis sat with her sketchbook closed on her lap, fingers laced over the cover as if it were a small animal she needed to keep calm. A migraine pressed behind her eyes in a dim, relentless pulse. She followed the slow orbit of a child's mobile above the pediatric desk, tiny planets drifting, never colliding. "Miss Ellis?" The nurse's voice was kind, a small light. "Dr. Blake will see you now." Naomi rose and gathered herself in the way some people gather flowers, gently, stem by stem. She smoothed her navy blouse, tucked a curl behind her ear, and followed the nurse down a corridor where the scent of antiseptic braided with something citrus and clean. On the walls, donors' names glimmered in brushed steel. She noticed a framed photo of volunteers reading to children. The sight steadied her a little, like catching a familiar melody in a strange room. The exam suite was quiet. A window admitted a square of winter sun across the floor, turning it into a pale stage. The nurse checked Naomi's vitals, asked questions about onset and frequency, about light sensitivity and nausea. Naomi answered softly, apologetically, as if regretful for troubling the world. And then he was there. Dr. Ethan Blake entered with a folder and a presence that felt like the sudden easing of a fever. Not because he was handsome, though he was, but because something in his posture radiated calm, a composed tide that set every item in the room afloat in an orderly way. He offered a hand, palm warm, gaze steady. "Miss Ellis, I'm Ethan Blake. Thank you for coming in." "Naomi is fine," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Thank you for seeing me." He nodded, a small acknowledgement that felt like respect rather than routine. "I've reviewed your intake. Migraines with aura, intermittent blurring, and one fainting episode last month. Is that right?" She agreed, describing how light fractured into prisms, how sounds could sharpen to a wire. He listened without interruption, pen poised but rarely used, as if he preferred to take notes in his attention rather than on paper. When she faltered, searching for the right word, he waited, allowing silence to be a bridge instead of a cliff. "Have you noticed triggers?" he asked. "Stress? Dehydration? Changes in sleep?" "Drawings," she said, startled by her own answer. "When I'm working late, when I forget to eat, sometimes after story time, when the room is loud and bright, I get this afterglow. And then the ache." He offered. The words landed in her with the clean weight of truth. For an instant, she imagined her mind as a room full of small lamps, each one needing its own shade. "May I examine you?" he asked. "I'll explain each step." He guided her through the ritual with careful clarity, never rushing. His hands were precise and respectful. A tap beneath the knee, a brush of light along her gaze, a cotton wisp on the cheek that felt like the wing beat of a moth. "Follow my finger," he said, moving his hand slowly through air that seemed to thicken between them. "Tell me when you feel this. Close your eyes. Tell me if you hear the change." When he held up the card of letters, she read them in a whisper, the smallest lines wavering like minnows. He adjusted the lamp, dimming the harshness until the letters steadied. "Better?" he asked. "Much." He took her blood pressure again, then set the cuff aside with a quiet, satisfied motion. "Your neurological exam is reassuring," he said. "I want to order an MRI. Not because I'm alarmed, but because we should be thorough. In the meantime, I'll suggest a migraine plan. Hydration, magnesium, a triptan for acute episodes, and boundaries around screen time. Artistic screen time included." A faint glint of humor. "Do you have support at work to take breaks?" She surprised herself by laughing softly. "I'm the librarian who reminds everyone else to take breaks. I suppose I should listen to my own posters." He turned the monitor toward her, pulling up a gentle graphic of blood vessels like a luminous tree. This is the dance between nerves and circulation. Think of your brain as a city, beautiful, busy, exquisitely lit. Migraines are power surges that darken neighborhoods for a while. Our task is to steady the grid. She leaned in without meaning to. The blue of the screen illuminated his profile. Fine, almost tired lines around his eyes spoke of nights he did not sleep so others could. She wondered what it cost a person to carry so much steadiness. He noticed her attention and sat back, giving her space. "Do you have questions for me, Naomi?" One rose up before she could stop it. "Do they go away?" "The surges. They can be tamed," he said. "Not always erased, but taught to behave. We'll learn your patterns and work with them instead of against them." "We." The pronoun felt like the arrival of a lantern in a dim hallway. He typed the MRI order, then printed a sheet. Dietary tips, red flags, the name of a meditation app he recommended to surgical residents who lived too long on coffee and adrenaline. He handed it to her, and their fingers barely brushed. Nothing really, a passing of paper. But the air charged for a heartbeat, as if the room recognized something the mind had not caught up to yet. She looked away first. He looked away second. "Will I be awake for the MRI?" she asked, clearing her throat. "Awake, but still. The machine is loud. If you're claustrophobic, we can provide medication. Tell the tech what you need. This place does better when people say what they need." Something in the phrasing eased her. She thought of the little girl in her sketchbook and felt, for the first time in days, that the page might hold steady beneath her hand. He stood, and she did too. The appointment had not been long, but it had gently rearranged the furniture inside her. At the door he paused, his hand on the silver handle, expression thoughtful, almost tender without crossing any line. "Naomi," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice felt like an affirmation. "Your work with children, keep it near. Brains respond to joy. Sometimes it's as therapeutic as any prescription I can write." She nodded, warmth rising through the ache. "Thank you, Dr. Blake." "Ethan is fine," he said, then corrected himself with a soft self-consciousness that humanized him. "Outside of the hospital." "Here, I'm Dr. Blake." She smiled, a small private thing. "Understood." When she stepped back into the corridor, the hum of the hospital seemed gentler, as if the building had exhaled. She tucked the folded plan into her sketchbook and moved toward the elevators, passing the window where winter's sun broke over the courtyard fountain. A mother and child stood there, hands linked, pointing at a bird that had landed on the stone rim. The child laughed. The sound threaded through Naomi like silver. Behind her, in the quiet of the exam room, Ethan lingered a moment longer than necessary. He set his pen down, then picked it up again, a man unused to unnecessary motions. On his desk, her name remained on the open chart, curving letters, careful loops, the handwriting of someone who tends to small things until they bloom. He closed the file gently, as one might close a door against a draft. Then he turned to the window and listened to the city, feeling the faintest shift within himself. A recalibration he could not label. A steadier rhythm under the ribcage, as if a metronome had been set to a truer time. On Peachtree Street, Naomi pressed a palm to her temple, breathed through the fading pulse, and stepped into the daylight. The sky had cleared. The traffic sounded like distant surf. She told herself the appointment had simply given her a plan. But as she walked, she kept her other hand over the sketchbook, warm against the paper, aware, without understanding why, that something inside had begun to turn toward the light. The MRI suite lived at the end of a corridor that swallowed footsteps. Naomi followed a technician through glass doors and into a room where the machine hummed like a sleeping animal. The white cylinder shone too bright, too clean, as if it could taste fear. She folded her hands to keep from touching her own throat. "Headphones," the tech said gently. "It's loud." "Choose a station?" "Classical," Naomi whispered. "Something with strings." A cellist began to breathe through the speakers, low and human. The table slid her inward, the ceiling drawing close, and for a suspended second, Naomi felt the old childhood panic. Closets with the light off, blankets tucked too tight. She opened her eyes wide, following the flecks in the machine's paint as if they were constellations, and she were mapping a sky no one else could see. "Miss Ellis?" The tech's voice came through the headset. "You're doing well. We'll speak between sequences." The first burst of sound, Metal striking metal, a rhythm like thunder learning to count, filled the hollow around her. She anchored herself with a trick she taught the Shire children at storytime. Choose 5 things you can hear, then 4 you can feel, 3 you can see, 2 you can smell, 1 you can name without saying it out loud. She rode the noise like weather. When the music returned, the cello line found her and held her there. Somewhere beyond the glass, Ethan reviewed the imaging protocol, his gaze moving between monitor and patient, clinician's focus threaded with something softer. He watched the small rise and fall of her breath, the steadiness she summoned like a craft, not a miracle. When the sequence ended, he leaned toward the microphone the tech offered. "Naomi," he said, voice quiet, unhurried. "You're halfway there. Keep the breaths even. Let the sound pass through you." She hadn't expected his voice. It entered the narrow space and widened it by degrees. He did not tell a story or offer a promise. He lent a rhythm, and she matched it. The machine thundered again, an iron heart, and she let it beat around her while the cello wove a bridge. When it was done, the room regained its ordinary size. The table slid her back into air, and Naomi blinked at the ceiling as if surfacing from deep water. The tech helped her sit, offered water, complimented her stillness. Outside, the corridor welcomed her with its simple fluorescent mercy. Ethan met her near the door. White coat open, tie slightly loosened as if he'd remembered. Midway through the morning, that air was something a person could share. "You did well," he said. The words did not ring with clinical praise. They felt like respect. "I kept thinking of a cello," she replied, surprising them both. "Good choice," a brief smile, less confrontational than drums. Back in his office, he pulled up preliminary images, the brain rendered in tender grays and luminous whites. He explained without spectacle. No ominous shadows, no silent architecture gone awry. "We'll wait for the radiologist's formal read," he said. "But this is reassuring." Relief came as warmth behind her ribs, subtle and delayed, like sun moving out from behind a courthouse of clouds. "Thank you. The plan stays the same for now," he continued. "We'll tailor it when the full report lands." He swiveled the monitor to show her something that was not strictly necessary for comprehension. A sweep of arterial trees, the lacework of perfusion. "Most people see a problem set," he said lightly. "I see a cathedral." She studied the luminous branches and thought of her sketchbook, filled with windowed cities and lantern-lit gardens. "I draw cathedrals," she said before she could stop herself. "Not with spires, with people." His eyes flickered, interest, not intrusion. "Do you carry your work with you?" She hesitated, then slid the sketchbook from her bag and opened to a fresh page, almost on instinct. Her pencil found its path. In a few strokes, a child appeared, in profile, head tilted up, a paper crown askew. Under her hand, lines steadied. She shaded the crown crooked, the smile not perfect but true. She turned the page for him to see and felt suddenly too bare, as if she'd removed a glove in winter and offered her palm to weather. Ethan leaned in without reaching, an act of discipline and courtesy both. "She knows she's worth the coronation," he said, "even if the crown doesn't fit the way the world expects." Naomi swallowed. It was not the compliment, but the comprehension that undid her. In that quiet beat, she felt the precise place where care, the calibrated field of his work, touched the edge of something else. Not romance yet, not even the rumor of it, simply the recognition of another human being's interior map. He sat back. "May I ask one more question?" She nodded. "What do your migraines do to your art?" "They steal the edges," she said. "The lines go soft and the colors get loud, and I can't convince the picture to listen." She gave a small, helpless laugh and, because honesty had already gotten a foothold, added, "I hate that my body can be rude to my work." "Bodies are not rude," he said gently. "They're insistent. We can teach yours a different language." He scribbled a note. "Light filters for your studio. A rule about meals that feels less like a rule and more like kindness. And, if you're willing, 15 minutes of stillness after story time. Not a luxury, a practice. 15 minutes of stillness while toddlers pound on the glass to show me their stickers?" She teased, partly to see if he would understand. His smile widened. the controlled kind that grew from the eyes first. In a back room then, or a stairwell with a decent window. I'll write, medically indicated daydreaming, on your accommodations form. The laugh that escaped her was unguarded. It loosened the migraine's last knot, and for a breath she forgot why her hands had trembled at the start of the day. He printed the form, signed it with a fountain pen whose ink bloomed a clean blue. As she reached to take it, their fingers touched. Again the briefest press, again the small current that said, alive, more than it said anything dangerous. Both withdrew almost at once, as if the air between them were delicate and worth preserving. Naomi, he said softly, the way a person says a name when he is calibrating his own distance. We'll meet in 2 weeks to review the full report and adjust your plan. If anything worries you before then, call the office. Don't negotiate with pain alone. She nodded. I've spent a lot of years negotiating with quiet instead. The admission surprised her. It did not feel like confession. It felt like weather report. You don't owe the world your silence, he said. Least of all, your own body. She tucked the form and the MRI printouts into her bag, slid the sketchbook on top like a shield and a promise. At the door she paused, something unnameable shifting through the room, the awareness of a threshold, not crossed but known. Thank you, she said again, and found she meant more than medicine. After she left, Ethan remained a moment, hands flat on the desk, as if listening for aftersound. He hadn't spoken his own private sentence, the one that rose these days when a patient's story touched the old bruise of Claire. I will not fail you. It was a vow he no longer voiced. It made him too rigid, too punishing with himself. Instead, he looked at the chair where Naomi had sat and tried a gentler interior phrase. I will attend. He liked the verb. It held care without conquest. Through the office window, the courtyard fountain caught a small wind and scattered it into spray. He watched the droplets flare and vanish. Somewhere in the building, a child laughed, a bright, irregular music. He gathered the morning's notes, squared the edges, and moved on to the next name on his list. Down on Peachtree, Naomi stepped into the afternoon and felt the world land softly. Her headache had thinned to a thread she could carry without dropping. She passed a storefront where a seamstress had draped a mannequin in unfinished fabric, pins catching light like tiny stars. She thought of cathedrals without spires, of crowns that fit after practice, of the measured kindness of a man who had learned to speak in careful sentences and, today, had chosen the ones that left room for her own. The line between care and connection remained exactly where it should be, clear, intact, honored. And yet, as Naomi turned toward the library, she knew it now by the shape it traced through her. A luminous boundary edged not with warning but with grace. 3 days later, winter sunlight poured over Atlanta like warm milk, softening edges that did not deserve to be sharp. Naomi left the library early with a small paper bag tucked beneath her arm. Inside, a hand-bound sketchbook for the nurses who had held her ease so gently. She had lettered the first page in indigo ink. For the hands that steady other hands. The bag rustled against her coat as she walked, a quiet applause she did not feel she had earned. St. Augustine's lobby hummed with weekday brightness, heels on tile, elevator chimes, the faint brassy lift of a saxophone from a street musician outside. Naomi paused to buy 2 coffees at the kiosk, one for the nurse's station and, without admitting it to herself, one more for a name she had no right to be thinking of. She balanced both cups in their cardboard cradle, smoothed the self-conscious breath, and stepped into the elevator. The doors opened on the neurology floor, and time committed its favorite trick, a small mischief disguised as fate. Naomi took a step. Someone rounded the corner. The coffee tray lurched, then rose, too late. A dark constellation bloomed across a white shirt. "Oh, no," she blurted, breath snagging on the vowel. "I'm so sorry." Ethan looked down at his coat, then up at her, and something like surprised relief brightened his face. "You have improved my typography," he said, glancing at the coffee pattern. I was overdue for less symmetry. Her mortification faltered, then wavered into a helpless laugh. "You're very kind to disaster. I'm kind to accidents that smell like hazelnut." He reached into his pocket and produced an old-fashioned handkerchief, the linen pressed, edges stitched with a thin blue line. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he dabbed the fabric at the edges of the spill with surgeon's patience, as if even stains deserved a measured approach. "I can pay for dry cleaning," she offered, words tumbling. "Or a new shirt, or a dash dash. Let me save us both from receipts," he said. "There's a spare in my office. Will you wait a moment while I pretend to be a respectable professional?" The corner of his mouth tilted. "And perhaps you'll let me replace the casualty in your tray." She held up what remained. One brimming cup, one mostly empty cup bravely steaming through its loss. "I have a survivor. Then the least I can do is deliver you a drink that did not fight in traffic." He gestured toward a bench beneath a window where winter light lay like a quiet companion. "Give me 5 minutes." He returned in 3, tie new, shirt crisp, a second cup in his hand as promised. They sat side by side, a palm's breadth of air between them, the kind that notices itself and tries not to. Naomi placed the paper bag in her lap, suddenly shy of its handmade heart. "For the nurses?" he asked. She nodded. "They made the MR I feel smaller than it was. I wanted to make something bigger for them in return. That is how grace usually does its math," he murmured. They sipped without speaking for a moment. From somewhere down the hall came the steady wheel song of a gurney and the soft volley of voices trading comfort like a shared scarf. Naomi watched a strip of sunlight creep up the far wall and felt the day unwrap her shoulders an inch at a time. "Headaches today?" he asked. Purely physician, purely human. "Quieter," she said. "I tried the light filter suggestion. It turned my office into a lake at morning." "Good," he replied, and the words sounded like a small, earned medal. "Keep the lake." She turned the cup in her hands. "I didn't come to see you," she said, then flushed. "I mean, I wasn't planning. This wasn't—" "I understand," he said, saving her with a softness that did not feel like rescue so much as permission. "I'm glad the day made room." They watched the courtyard fountain through the glass. A wind lifted, caught the water into a brief green veil, then let it fall. Naomi thought of the girl in her sketchbook with the paper crown and wondered if she had drawn a prophecy by accident. Ethan set his cup on the bench, turned slightly toward her. "You teach story time," he said. "What stories do you save for yourself?" "The ones that make the quiet brave," she answered before she could edit it into something smaller. "And the ones where the smallest kindness chooses the largest door." She felt his attention settle, not heavy, just present. It made truth want to tell itself. He nodded slowly, as if filing the sentence under a heading he respected. "I was thinking," he said, cautious, careful with the line they both could feel beneath their feet, "about the hospital's pediatric art program. They host a Saturday hour sometimes. Volunteers sketch with the kids who are able to sit up. Would that be of interest? No pressure. If the noise is too much, we can make it quieter." "We." The pronoun tipped the day a little nearer to her. "I'd like that," she said, "if there's a corner with a window." "We have a corner with 3, he said. "I'll give your name to the coordinator." Then, to the space rather than to her, because that was how one kept faith with boundaries, he added, "You were steady in the MRI. The steadiness wasn't the machines." "It helped that someone said my name," she replied, staring into her coffee. It made the room bigger. Silence followed, not empty, not crowded. He did not apologize for speaking then, or qualify it. She did not insist she needed no help. Something about the mutual refusal to diminish made the bench feel like neutral country, a place where strangers could rest without pretending they weren't strangers. A nurse approached, all quick affection and practical grace. "Miss Ellis? Oh, you're an angel. Are those for us?" Naomi handed over the paper bag, flushed at the praise, listened as the nurse exclaimed over the hand-bound spine and the careful lettering. "We'll keep it at the desk for notes," the nurse said. "A good hospital runs on kindness and sticky paper." She squeezed Naomi's shoulder with gratitude and breezed away. Ethan watched the exchange with that same, almost smile that began in his eyes. "You mend pages," he said, "and people read better afterward." "I'm not sure I mend them," she said. "I just convince them they can hold." That is mending. The clock above the elevator nudged them towards separate maps. He rose first, then paused, as if listening to a word he wasn't going to say. "I have a consult," he said. "Thank you for the coffee I didn't deserve." "You can owe me a clean shirt," she teased, surprising them both with her ease. "It would be my honor to owe you anything so simple." He stepped back, the distance repainted with care. "2 weeks, Naomi. We'll make a better plan with the full report." She nodded, as much promise as farewell. He went left, she went right. The air knit itself where they had been. In the elevator, Naomi saw her reflection in the steel and thought, "I look like someone the day has chosen." The idea startled her. It did not frighten her. On the sidewalk, the saxophone found a slow velvet phrase. A few blocks away, in his office, Ethan unbuttoned his borrowed spare and found, tucked into the pocket by a nurse with a sense of humor, a small square of paper torn from a fresh sketchbook. In indigo ink, a sentence. "For the hands that steady other hands." He closed his eyes and rested his fingertips on the words as if they were a pulse, counting until the number matched the steadier time he'd begun to recognize. Then he slipped the paper into his wallet, not as a token, but as a compass, and returned to the work that was finally, gently, becoming more than the keeping of storms. The cafe across from St. Augustine's wore its afternoon light like a shawl, loose, forgiving, a little frayed at the edges. Naomi chose a small table by the window and set her sketchbook on the chair beside her, as if it were a guest with good manners. Outside, buses sighed and exhaled their passengers. Inside, spoons tapped porcelain with the steady optimism of rain. Ethan arrived a minute early, the way careful men do. He had traded his white coat for a charcoal sweater that made him look suddenly human, and perhaps a little younger. When he spotted her, relief passed over his face with almost embarrassing clarity, and then a quieter expression settled, the one that knows its own outlines and respects the air around another person. "Coffee?" he asked, as if they hadn't already agreed to it, and when she nodded, he returned with 2 cups and a plate of shortbread that looked like small moons. He did not sit across from her. He sat at a congenial angle, leaving a wedge of space for caution and the truth. Outside the window, a pigeon strutted with ridiculous authority. Naomi smiled despite herself. "How is the lake?" he asked. She blinked. "Oh, the light filters. Still and silver. The children say the librarian lives underwater." "They're not entirely wrong," he said, pleased. "How was story time?" "Triumphant. We survived 6 verses of a dragon song and only 1 paper crown emergency." He laughed, the uncollected kind that warms the mouth before it escapes. The sound startled them both into a small, companionable silence. "Thank you for this," Naomi said finally, tracing a finger along the rim of her cup. "For the breathing room," he nodded. "I thought it might be good to speak where nothing hums or beeps." He lifted his own cup, then set it down without drinking. "Tell me about your drawings. What are you working on when your head allows it?" She hesitated and then, because he was watching her in a way that felt like standing in a doorway and being told there is time, she opened the sketchbook. The first page showed a city at night, each window a lantern, each lantern a little pulse of yellow. On the next, a girl in rain boots stared at her reflection in a puddle deep enough to be a sky. "These are for the children?" he asked. "For me," she admitted. "I draw for them at the library. These are the stories I haven't found the words for yet." He studied the pages without reaching to touch them. "You make quiet look like habitat, not punishment." She looked down quickly, as if her cheeks might show everything. "Some days it is. Some days it's a disguise." "What would happen if the disguise slipped?" "I might be seen," she said softly, "and I've never been sure if I'm ready for that." He folded his hands. "Seeing is part of my work," he said. "It is not the same thing as claiming." Something in her steadied. The cafe's noise diffused into a kind of cotton. Time drew its knees up and rested. "Your sister," she said gently. "You mentioned her once. Only her name." "Claire." He said it like a vow, and then took a breath that had the shape of memory. She was 12 when she died. Appendicitis that was misread as anxiety. By the time someone listened, the infection had turned the world mean. He let the cup warm his hands. "It isn't that I believe I could have saved her. It's that I learned how much harm silence can do when it wears a white coat." Naomi's fingers tightened over the spine of her sketchbook. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not as sympathy, more like respect. "It was a long time ago," he said, and then, almost apologetically, "I organized my life so the story wouldn't repeat itself. Training, publication, recognition. If I built the right scaffolding, I thought I would be unable to fail. No one tells you scaffolding casts a shadow. Shadows help us see what stands, she offered, surprised by the thought as it left her. But they're not a place to sleep. He turned the sentence over, a careful appraisal. True, he sipped his coffee. And you? How did you learn to be so gentle without vanishing? Her mouth tilted. Trial, error, a grandmother who refused to whisper, a friend who reminds me, twice a week, to buy my own flowers. Drawing made me brave by accident. Sometimes a line insists on itself, and you have to follow it, or the page will know you lied. He watched her as if the world had finally given him an answer to a question he'd asked for years. Medicine teaches the opposite, he said quietly. Hide the hand. Make the line look effortless. If it trembles, the patient will read the tremor and make it their own. Maybe the honest thing is to let them see the care, not the fear, she replied. Children know when a hand is trying. He smiled at that and reached for the shortbread, breaking one moon in half and setting the larger piece on her napkin without remark. The gesture felt like a note in the margin. Here, strength where you don't expect it. They spoke of smaller things then, the kind that sign a truce with the larger ones. He told her the jazz station he listened to when surgeries ran late. She confessed to naming the library stepladder Goliath and muttering threats at it when it pinched. He admitted he'd once fainted at his first autopsy and decided to learn to stand by learning to breathe. Breathing seems to be my current degree program, she mused. I'm learning to do it without apologizing. He inclined his head. An advanced discipline. The sun slid lower. The window's light turned honeyed in old world. A nurse passed by outside, recognized Ethan, waved with 2 fingers still holding a pen. The cafe's bell chimed as someone left and Winter entered, brief and honest. This is difficult, he said at last, because perhaps it needed saying, because care had its lines. Wanting to know you more, and also wanting, fiercely, to be the kind of physician who never blurs a boundary. She stared at her hands. I don't want to be a boundary you broke, she said. I want to be a person you chose. Something in his expression unlatched, not wildly, just a click a locksmith would admire. He set his cup down and spoke with deliberate plainness. Then I will make a path that honors both things. I can transfer your care to a colleague I trust. If you agree, no pressure, no clock. I would rather sit on this side of the river with you and name the water honestly than wade in without a bridge. The words found a place inside her, like a key finding its lock. Not because they were grand, but because they were built of measured planks. I'll think about it, she said, and meant it. I want to do this right, whatever this is. He nodded, both gratitude and relief in the gesture. Whatever it becomes, he said, may it never require you to make yourself small. They gathered their things slowly, as if the air might bruise. At the door they paused. The late sun put a gold edge on his hair, and she felt the day reorganize itself one last time. Naomi, he said, almost formal, and then, because habit is a gentler companion than courage. 2 weeks. She smiled. 2 weeks. He held the door. She stepped out into winter that smelled faintly of oranges from a vendor's cart, and for the first time in a long while, the street did not feel like a test she might fail. She walked toward the library with the sketchbook under her arm and the odd sense that the story was writing itself more bravely than she knew how to ask it to. Saturday arrived with a washed blue sky, the kind Atlanta wears when winter chooses mercy. The pediatric wing of St. Augustine's had traded its ordinary quiet for a festival of soft noise. Markers uncapped with tiny pops, paper sliding from dispensers, the squeak of rolling carts laden with crayons. Sunlight spilled through 3 tall windows and lay across the floor in wide, forgiving bands. Naomi stood at the threshold with a tote of brushes on her shoulder and felt the room invite her inward the way a hand invites a bird. Naomi? The art coordinator, Sharon, pink-lipped and brisk, came forward with a smile. Thank you for coming. We keep it simple. Let them lead, keep the mess dignified. And when a masterpiece needs a title, we never settle for untitled. I can do that, Naomi said. Her voice was steady, though a small tremor moved under it the way riverbed stones move beneath a current. She began at the table near the windows. A boy with a buzz cut and a pirate sticker on his IV pole considered a sheet of paper as if daring it to blink. "What should I draw?" he demanded, not looking up. "What do you wish you could see out that window?" Naomi asked, sliding into the chair beside him. "A dragon," he said immediately, "but a nice one." "Of course," Naomi agreed, "the kind who returns library books on time." She drew the curve of a neck, left the rest a suggestion. He seized the green marker and filled in scales with the intensity of a storm choosing a sky. When he faltered, she didn't correct. She asked questions, and the drawing built itself around his answers. Across the room, Ethan paused in the doorway. He had come in quietly, no coat, no clipboard, and stood as if he were the one visiting, eyes adjusting to the gentler logic of colored pencils and glue sticks. He watched Naomi without watching, the way a man watches fire from the far side of a hearth. She did not try to fix the children. She attended them. The difference landed in him like a small bell rung close to bone. Sharon intercepted him with a whisper. "Doctor." Her glance flicked to Naomi and back. Not unkind, simply alive to weather. Ethan nodded, acknowledged the barometer she was offering, and kept his distance. At the second table, a girl with a bandana and a monarch butterfly tattoo drawn in marker on her wrist waited with studied indifference. "I can't do hands," she announced, daring the fact to argue. "Good," Naomi said. "We'll draw hands that are thinking." "How?" "By listening to what they're holding." Naomi placed her own palm on the paper and traced it lightly, then added a notebook under the fingers, a pencil poised like a small, astonished bird. "Hands don't have to be perfect," she said, "only honest." The girl stared and then, with a struggle not to smile, began to draw her own. The outline wobbled and righted itself. The butterfly on her real wrist shone like a vow. Between tables, Naomi glanced up and saw Ethan. The surprise of him was both sharp and somehow already prepared for. He didn't approach. He offered a nod that felt like a hand lifted to shade someone else's eyes. She returned it. A minimal ceremony, but the air read it and softened. A toddler in dinosaur pajamas patted the empty chair beside Naomi and without discussion, climbed into her lap, thrusting a blunt crayon at the paper. "Rawr," he explained. "Absolutely," Naomi replied, solemn. They drew teeth that looked like triangles learning to sing. Later, when the hour had thinned and some children dozed or were wheeled away for tests, Naomi carried a stack of finished drawings to the drying rack. She lingered at the windows, palms on the sill, breathing the faint citrus of hospital clean that always reminded her of freshly peeled promises. Her body felt the good fatigue of right work. Her head, for once, kept quiet. Ethan stepped closer, stopping at a courteous distance. Sharon said the dragons were well behaved. "They prefer librarians," Naomi said, and the shared smile that followed had more ease than the others before it, as if trust had moved a chair into the room and sat down. He glanced toward the tables. "You have a way of making the air behave," he said. "The monitors are still blinking. The IVs are still hissing, and yet somehow the room remembers it has windows." She lifted a shoulder, embarrassed. "They do the work. I just keep the paper still." "For what it's worth," he said, then paused, choosing the words the way one chooses a scalpel. "I've requested that Dr. Annika Shah take over your care. She's exceptional. It allows me to—" He searched for the right verb. "Step aside without stepping away." Something steadied in her chest. A quiet that didn't ask for apology. "Thank you," she said. "That feels like a true thing." They stood together without touching, the window light naming them both and demanding nothing. Down the hall, a child laughed in a key that always sounds like permission. "Walk?" he asked after a moment. They took the service corridor to a small courtyard few people used, a square of worn brick, a bench, 3 camellia bushes blooming as if winter were only a rumor. The fountain's thin thread of water murmured to itself. On weekends, the place belonged to nurses with contraband cookies and doctors who needed to remember sky. "Sometimes," Ethan said, sitting at the far end of the bench, "I think medicine mistakes volume for wisdom." "Libraries do that with silence," Naomi answered, as if quiet were inherently profound. "Sometimes it's just a room holding its breath." He studied the camellias, their porcelain stubbornness. "After Claire died, I swore I'd never miss a whisper again. I built my career on listening hard. And yet somewhere along the way, I started hearing only emergencies." "And today?" she asked. Today I heard paper, he said, almost surprised, and laughter, and my own pulse, but not as an alarm. He glanced at her, the look unguarded in a way he would have corrected in any other room. You change the temperature of things. She shook her head. The children do. Maybe they do, he allowed, and maybe you remind the room how to hold warm without burning. They sat long enough for the sunlight to move. Naomi unwound the tie of her tote and pulled out a small tin of watercolor pans, their cakes worn into moons and gullies. She opened her sketchbook to a blank page and, without asking why, wet the brush. A courtyard took shape, brick in softened squares, a bench rendered in quick, respectful lines, the camellias with their impossible white. She painted a man and a woman as two shadows in the same light, neither touching the other, both illuminated by the same patient sun. She didn't mean to show him. When the image finished itself, her hand stilled, then turned the book as if the motion belonged to someone practical and kind. Ethan regarded the page. No comment rose first. He allowed the seeing to arrive before the praise. You left space, he said finally, voice hushed as if they were near a sleeping child. That's the precise dimension of restraint. It's the only way the white can speak, she said. Watercolor needs air. He nodded, the understanding more than artistic. So do we. A flock of pigeons erupted from a ledge and settled again, without ceremony. Somewhere, a code cart chimed and was rolled past without alarm. Time gathered itself, not to press them forward but to make room. I don't know what this is, Naomi said, closing the sketchbook carefully, but I know it doesn't belong to a machine that hums or a chart that needs signatures. It belongs to the part of the hospital that wasn't built, Ethan said, and to the part of me that forgot how to be quiet without going cold. They stood. He held the gate. She passed through. The brief nearness of it felt like the sound of a match catching, small, undeniable, gone again, but leaving the scent of possibility in the air. Back in the ward, the dragon boy slept with his green-scaled empire crumpled in one hand. The girl with the bandana had taped her drawn hands above her bed, palms open to the ceiling as if receiving weather. Naomi tucked her brush tin into the tote and pressed her palm lightly to the paper crowns drying on the rack. A benediction and a promise. When she turned to go, Ethan was watching the doorway the way a person watches a shoreline he has finally decided to swim toward. Not recklessly, not yet, but with the quiet decision that remakes a tide. The room noticed and, very gently, brightened. On Monday, the morning arrived with its collar buttoned. Naomi unlocked the library before the sun had settled on the brick, turned on the lamps one by one, and breathed the hush into something livable. When she opened her email, a subject line waited like a steady hand. Transfer of care, Dr. Shaw. The message was brief, professional, and kind. Dr. Ethan Blake had requested that Dr. Annika Shaw assume responsibility for Naomi's neurology plan, effective immediately. Attached were notes as orderly as linen. The MRI report, the migraine protocol, a follow-up appointment time with Dr. Shaw, and a single line in Ethan's own voice tucked at the end like a folded card. You are in excellent hands. If anything feels unclear, let me know, and I will make it clear. No flourish, no subtext scribbled in the margin, and yet the space between the words felt quietly rearranged, as if someone had opened a window in a room you thought was sealed. At noon, Naomi told a circle of children the story of a mouse who mistakes thunder for an argument between clouds. After lunch, she mended 3 spines and a friendship. The day did its honest work, and within it something small, insistent, began to ask for evening. By late afternoon, a fine rain had gathered itself over Atlanta, the kind that doesn't fall so much as hang, a luminous veil threaded through streetlight. Naomi took the bus to St. Augustine's for a quick signature on an accommodation form Dr. Shaw needed. The hospital wore its weather like a second glistening skin. She signed at the admissions desk and turned to go, only to find Ethan halfway across the lobby, his presence quiet and inevitable as tide. Naomi, he said, stopping at a respectful distance. I didn't expect Sharon mentioned you might stop by. His hair held a few obedient raindrops, each reflecting the lobby's pale ceiling like a small, captured moon. It was just paperwork, she said. Thank you for arranging everything. I'm glad we did this the right way, he replied. The right way, The words steadied the air between them, even as they invited it closer. He glanced toward the revolving door where rain made a necklace of the city. "Do you have a minute? There's a place on the roof, if you're warm enough." She hesitated, then nodded. The elevator carried them without talk, as if speech might tilt it. Two maintenance workers stepped off on 7. They rode to 8. A short stairwell completed the climb. Ethan pushed open a metal door, and the evening revealed itself. Flat roof, waist-high wall, the skyline rising like sheet music beyond the hospital's shoulder. The rain here was a mist you walked through rather than under. It beaded on eyelashes and made the world glow. He didn't guide her to the ledge. He simply stood nearby, hands in pockets, and let the view choose their distance. Ambulance lights stitched a red seam along the street below. Somewhere a siren argued with the rain, and then grew courteous and passed. "I spoke with the ethics office this morning," he said, tone factual, almost tender. "I wanted nothing ambiguous. About you, about us, about the care you deserve. It matters that boundaries aren't approximations." "It does," she said and meant it. The roof felt like a new page, blank, wet, innocent. She tucked her hands into her coat sleeves to keep from admitting she was cold. Without a word, he unbuttoned his coat and set it, not on her shoulders, but along the low wall between them, a dark barrier taking the mist. The gesture was both offering and restraint. She smiled at the precision of it. "I keep thinking of your watercolor," he said. "How you left space." "White needs air," she answered. "So does kindness." He exhaled, a breath that fogged and vanished. "There's something I haven't told you. Not a secret, just a room in my life I avoid. My family funds part of the hospital's research. They like legible stories, achievement, legacy, names on walls. I've let the story they prefer speak for me more often than I should." She didn't ask the easy question. Instead, she watched the city wearing its thousands of lit windows and said, "What story do you prefer?" "The one where work is a vow, not a costume," he said. "And the one where love isn't a press release." He glanced at her, almost apologetic. "I'm trying to learn how to live it out loud without turning it into spectacle." Rain ticked softly against the metal door behind them. Naomi thought of the dragon boy, sleeping with green scales crumpled in his fist. She thought of paper crowns and hands that needed titles. She felt a calm arrive that did not ask to be named. "I don't want to be a decision against your life," she said. "I want to be a decision for it." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the sentence had placed its palm against his ribs. When he opened them, the carefulness remained, but it had been joined by something else, a quieter courage that didn't announce itself. "I didn't ask you up here to borrow an answer," he said, "only to give you one. I am choosing this, whatever it becomes, with the lights on, with no one half-held, least of all you." A pulse found its kinder rhythm. The rain leaned in the slightest bit, as if the sky had cupped its hand to listen. "Ethan," she said, his name a test and a harbor both. "We are no one's emergency right now." He laughed once, a small breath that broke and healed in the same second. "Will you?" He stopped, recalibrated. "May I walk you to the elevator when you're ready to go? And may I ask if you would have dinner with me somewhere there are no pagers and no forms to sign?" She answered the second question first. Yes. The first answered itself. They had already been walking, not down, but toward. They did not rush the moment that followed, perhaps because breaking a rule is easiest when it feels like a jump. They wanted this to feel like a door. When they reached the small overhang by the stairwell, where the rain made a curtain and the city pretended not to look, they both paused. He lifted a hand, not to her face, but to the damp curl at her temple, as one might lift a leaf to see the vein, careful, asking. She tilted, the faintest consent. The kiss, when it came, was not an astonishment. It was a confirmation, warm, brief, fluent in the language both had been practicing without moving their mouths. "I see you. I will not erase you to keep you. I can stand here with my hands open." They parted the width of a breath. Neither apologized. The rain made a sound like applause heard through a wall. "Dinner," he said, and the word felt larger than it had any right to be. "Dinner," she echoed. "And I'll bring a crown that fits crooked." "That would suit me," he said, smiling, an expression that reached the places his professional ones never touched. On the way down, the elevator chose to be slow. A volunteer climbed in on 6 with a vase full of camellias. The scent pooled at their feet like a note in the margin. On 5, the doors opened and no one entered. The rain showed itself in the gap as a silver thread they were both now holding. In the lobby, he did not take her hand. He let the space remain honest. At the revolving door, she stepped into the street's mist and turned back, pushing her palm against the glass for a childish second. He matched it from inside, their hands divided by a pain and joined by warmth, an image a passing child pointed at and later would draw. Outside, the city wore its pearls of water and kept its promises. Naomi walked toward the bus stop, coat hugged close, the taste of rain and a new language on her mouth. Behind her, Ethan stood in the lobby, watching the door spin, feeling the interior scaffolding of his life shift. Less like a tower, more like a trellis. Something could grow here, something already had. The gala unfurled like a silk banner across the city. White lights in the magnolias, black cars like beetles lining the curb, a string quartet making evening feel expensive. The Blake Foundation had chosen the High Museum for its winter fundraiser. Glass and steel lifted into the cold like a hymn. Inside, waiters sailed with trays of small, perfect food, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and polished wood. Naomi paused on the museum's front steps, smoothing the seam of the simple charcoal dress she had chosen, the one that let her belong to her own body. Ethan offered his arm and did not rush her, the way you do not hurry the second before a breath. "You look like the reason someone invented Twilight," he said quietly. She wanted to laugh it off, but the words found a clean space inside her. "Lead the way, then." The lobby held a fountain whose water rose and fell like the museum's own measured breath. Donor names glowed on the wall in tasteful platinum. Ethan greeted a curator, a surgeon, a board chair. He knew their first names, their children, the year they ran marathons to prove something to themselves. If he moved a little more carefully with Naomi at his side, it wasn't from shame. It was from something nearer to reverence. "This is a lot of glass," she murmured as they stepped into the main gallery. "Architecture that refuses to hide," he said. "You and the building will get along." Paintings held stillness in expensive frames. A large canvas, blue upon blue, seemed to breathe if you looked long enough. Naomi tilted her head, listening with her eyes, and Ethan watched her watch, the way a person watches a meadow take its rightful wind. Introductions came as expected. Faculty, trustees, donors with botanical first names and silver hair. Naomi offered small truths, not apologies. Some faces warmed. A few performed their politeness with the brittle, practiced dignity of porcelain figurines. A woman in a cream pantsuit smiled a fraction too widely and said, "And where did you two meet?" with the curiosity that expects a punchline it can forgive. "At the hospital," Naomi answered gently, "and since then, in rooms where space is treated kindly." She held the woman's gaze just long enough to let the sentence settle. The woman nodded, though her eyes slid toward Ethan as if the full translation lived there. Across the room, Victoria Blake stood with a congressman and a conductor, her posture a masterclass in legacy. She wore navy satin and the sort of necklace that has never attended a small event. When she saw them, her smile didn't falter. It refined itself. She excused herself with the effortless diplomacy of a woman who has spent a lifetime exiting and entering the same room. "Mother," Ethan said, not as a herald, more like a weather report. Naomi felt his arms shift, not to hide her, not to display her, but to say, "With Ethan." Victoria's gaze skimmed him, then settled on Naomi with the soft power of a searchlight. "And you must be Naomi." Her voice held roses and rules. "I am," Naomi said. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Blake." "Victoria," she corrected, extending a hand. The clasp was cool and immaculate. "Welcome. I hope my son hasn't bored you with MRI films and espressos." "He has an admirable ratio," Naomi said, smiling. "Science to coffee." Something unreadable flickered behind Victoria's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that the answer declined to be small. "Enjoy the collection," she said, angling her face toward the nearest salon. "It's a good year." She moved on, pulling the room in her wake. Ethan exhaled in a way that made Naomi want to steady a palm between his shoulders and say, "It's only air." "Did I pass?" Naomi asked lightly. This isn't an examination, he said, and yet his jaw had tightened. But thank you for refusing to shrink. I spent too many years practicing that, she said. I'm retired. They wandered to a mezzanine that opened above the central atrium. Below, people glittered. Above, a suspended walkway bridged two galleries, a literal bridge of glass, lit from beneath, daring guests to trust it. Naomi stepped onto it and felt the feathered vertigo of transparency. The city visible through her own feet. The party distant as a story someone else was telling. Walk out with me, she said. They went to the center and stopped. The quartet's music reached them, thinner, purer. Through the glass rail, Atlanta's lights wrote their interrupted sentences. Naomi rested her hand on the rail and looked down into motion that could not touch her. The sensation was not power. It was clarity. I don't belong to that room, she said finally. Not really. Neither do I, he answered. I'm fluent, but it isn't my first language. What is? He considered the question as if he owed it an honest map. Mornings in the residence lounge, he said. Tired laughter that forgives itself. The quiet at 3 a.m. when the OR lights feel like prayer. And lately, he glanced at her. The glance steadied. Lately, a library at the bottom of a lake. She smiled, the image returning like a friendly tide. From the far end of the bridge, a server in black walked carefully with a tray of sparkling water. As he reached them, a woman in emerald silk brushed his shoulder with her bag. Two glasses wavered. Naomi stepped in, quick and sure, steadying the tray with both hands before it tipped. Thank you, the server breathed, the gratitude of those trained to apologize for physics. No harm done, Naomi said. Let me take a glass to earn my heroism. When he moved on, Ethan looked at her as if he'd been waiting years to witness something that simple. You helped without making it a performance. Habit, she said. Children spill entire oceans. They lingered while the party continued to invent itself. Down below, Victoria glanced up once. Her expression did not change. Her attention did. She watched them in the way an architect watches a new kind of load-bearing. Tell me a truth, Naomi said, eyes still on the city. Something no program would print. He was quiet long enough to resist the impulse to say what might be admired. I am less brave than people think, he said. But I am learning a kind of courage that doesn't look like speed. She nodded. I am more afraid of being misread than of being disliked, she confessed. But I would rather tell the story myself than listen to a kinder version spoken by someone else. Their hands were inches apart on the rail. He did not close the distance. The glass beneath them, the span between galleries, the night lifting its shoulders, everything held, clear and unspectacular, exactly the way a bridge should. Come see something, he said at last, leading her back across the walkway to a small room off the main hall. It housed sketches, charcoal studies by a painter famous for his immaculate oils. Here the lines were all decision and doubt. Half-erased hands. Shoulders changed their minds. Faces began 3 inches to the left of where they ended. Naomi stood very still. He kept the revisions, she whispered. He let the public see the part that trembles. Ethan watched her and then, carefully, said, I think that's the only kind of truth that lasts. They did another circuit for good manners. Thank yous to the coordinator, a greeting to the hospital's CFO, a brief conversation with a resident Naomi liked on sight. When they returned to the lobby, the fountain kept its faithful arc, rising and returning as if to prove a theorem. Outside, air had sharpened. The magnolias held cold stars. Ethan helped her with her coat and then did nothing to the moment except let it exist. I can take you home, he offered, voice low. I'd like that, she said, and the words sounded less like permission than like belonging. They walked to the car. In the driver's door he paused. Not a hesitation, a recognition. Two worlds still visible through the same pane of glass, both requiring care. He opened the door for her, then rounded the hood to his side. When the car eased away from the museum's light, Naomi looked back once and saw the bridge. A slash of brightness in the dark, carrying strangers safely above the air. In the reflection on the passenger window, her face hovered beside the city's moving lights. She felt the floor steady under her, even as Atlanta blurred, and she thought, some bridges are made of steel and glass. Some are made of sentences that don't hurry, of quiet that doesn't punish, of hands that stay a respectful inch away until they are asked to do otherwise. She folded her hands in her lap, not to hide them, but to feel them. Beside her, Ethan drove with the patient attention of a man who had learned how to listen for small weather inside the body. The road unspooled, the night kept faith, and the space between their worlds, newly measured, newly named, held firm. Ethan's loft rose above the city like a quiet observatory, brick walls keeping the day outside, tall windows gathering the night into panes a person could touch. The elevator opened directly into the living room, and for a brief, suspended second, Naomi stood on the threshold, aware of her reflection superimposed on the dark glass. A woman in a charcoal dress, hand on a strap of her bag, breath held as if the air were a fragile instrument. "Come in," Ethan said. No flourish, only an invitation shaped like room. He set his keys in a shallow bowl and turned on lamps with linen shades. Light pooled in corners instead of conquering them. Books carried the weight of serious attention. A cello leaned against one wall, its bow sleeping. On a console, 3 photographs. A girl with laughing eyes, Claire, holding a paper crown. Sophie mid-giggle on a carousel. A river that might be Tennessee, silvered under cloud. "May I take your coat?" he asked. She unbuttoned it slowly, as if untying a sentence, and he hung it by the door. For a moment they did not move. The city pressed its constellation against the glass and waited with them. "Tea?" he offered. "Or something colder?" "Tea," she said. He smiled, relieved to be of use, and disappeared into the kitchen. Naomi touched the spine of a book, Marginalia by a poet who believed notes in the margins were love letters to understanding, and felt, absurdly, at home. Ethan returned with 2 cups and a plate of apricots and almonds, the tentative elegance of a man improvising hospitality. They sat at an angle on the couch, knees not quite aligned, shoulders tuned to the same silence. "How are you?" he asked, not out of obligation but out of curiosity, as if the answer might change what the night decided to be. "Light inside," she said, surprised by the accuracy. "As if someone opened a window in a room I forgot I had." He nodded, looking at the cup in his hands. "I've lived here for years," he said, "but there are corners I only turn on good days. Tonight feels like one." The tea cooled to drinkable. The apricots went half-eaten. They spoke in the way people do when the conversation is a bridge and not a performance. He told her he buys second-hand atlases for the notes written by other travelers, circles around coastal towns, exclamation points beside small museums. She told him she keeps a list of words that change color in certain light. Hush, threshold, keep. When the cello caught her eye again, he lifted it, not to play a song, but to place the bow on the strings and draw a single tone, low, human, without bravado. The sound walked across the room and sat down with them. "I'm out of practice," he said, and she shook her head, hearing what practice cannot give. Near the window, Atlanta opened its palms, trains stitching, a siren far away becoming polite, a late airplane riding its careful diagonal. Naomi stood and approached the glass. Her reflection hovered beside the city, transparent enough to let the lights pass through. Ethan joined her a moment later, not close enough to claim anything, close enough to belong to the same view. "I don't know how to be brave without turning it into theater," he said quietly. "You just were," she answered. "You offered a tone. Not a performance." Something steady clicked into place. He reached for her hand, slowly, like approaching a skittish bird, and stopped a breath before contact. "May I?" he asked, the question a soft rail against which the night could lean. Yes. Their hands met. Nothing exploded. The world did not tilt. A simpler miracle took place. 2 temperatures matched. He threaded their fingers and after a quiet minute, brought her knuckles to his mouth and pressed a kiss there. No deeper claim than gratitude. "Tell me if I go too fast," he said. "I will," she promised. "Tell me if I go quiet." "I will," he echoed. And the agreement felt like the first line of a covenant, lightweight and durable. They turned back to the room that had been waiting for them to choose it. He touched the zipper at the back of her dress as one might touch the seam of an old book, reverently, checking for strength. "Look at me," he said, not as command but as refuge. She did, and saw that his eyes were not bright with triumph. They were steady with attention. The zipper whispered. Fabric softened into gravity. He did not rush the simple weather of skin warming under air. He asked again, and again she said yes, and between each question and answer a small stillness opened where both could breathe. Her hands learned the shape of his shoulders. His learned the language of her back. In this grammar there were tenses for mercy, for pause, for laughter when a bracelet refused to cooperate, for the humility of starting over when the moment asked. They crossed no thresholds they hadn't named. When her breath caught, not from fear but from the old habit of bracing, he stilled and waited until she nodded. When he closed his eyes, she touched his face like a page as if to say, "Here is the margin where we will keep our notes." The loft altered around them without changing. Lamps gentled, the cello shadow lengthened, the city beyond glass agreeing to be witness and not judge. What happened next belonged less to choreography than to consent, less to choreography than to trust. If the world outside were a tide, it went out for a while and left them on a quiet strand, learning how to listen to each other's weather. After, they lay with the window open to the faintest cool, the kind of air that slips past curtains and decides to stay. Naomi rested her head on his chest and followed the unhurried drum there, counting until the numbers stopped meaning anything. He traced the bend of her shoulder with a fingertip, absent-minded and reverent at once. "I don't know how to talk about this without breaking it," he said. "Then don't," she murmured. "We can name it in the morning and find it unfazed." He laughed softly, that careful laugh again. "You make me feel unarmored without being unguarded. You make me feel chosen without being carried," she said. The building settled. Pipe sighed. Water somewhere found its level. He reached for the blanket at their feet and drew it over them, the way one covers a sleeping child. Unnecessary and utterly right. On the console, Claire's photograph watched without accusation. Naomi lifted her hand and touched the frame lightly. "She had brave eyes," she said. "She did." His voice thinned and steadied. "Thank you for seeing her." They fell quiet. The night grew its own corners. Somewhere a neighbor above ran a bath. The plumbing sang its small silver song. Ethan spoke into her hair, the words more exhale than declaration. "I didn't know there was a room left in me where this could happen without fear." "There is," she said, and felt the truth of it under her palm. "And it has windows." He slept first, which surprised him as he was doing it. His body, that precise instrument, surrendering to an ease that did not undo its tuning. Naomi watched his face soften from attention into rest, and felt the old, unspectacular joy that arrives when a person in your care becomes unafraid enough to look ordinary. When she finally closed her eyes, the city was still visible behind her lids, a scatter of small constellations. The page inside her had not been erased. It had been written on, in careful script, with margins left wide for future notes. The storm had not been banished so much as taught a gentler climate. They woke once in the dark to the sound of rain beginning, fine, tentative, as if the weather too were practicing tenderness. He reached for her hand, found it without searching, and fell back to sleep with their fingers interlaced. A notary's seal pressed into the wax of the night. Morning would arrive eventually with its honest questions, with breakfast and the unglamorous courage of living. But for now the loft held them, and the city cradled the loft, and the window, faithful witness, kept the lights like stars two people had earned. Dawn found them without ceremony. A pale film of light slid along the loft's brick, turned the window into clear water. Naomi woke to the hush of a city not yet opinionated, and the steady weight of Ethan's arm draped over her waist, a simple geometry that made sense. For a long minute she watched dust drift like slow snow in the slant of sun, and felt more rested than any sleep had ever promised. When Ethan stirred, it was with the startled softness of a man unfamiliar with waking content. He smiled, unperformed, a private animal, and pressed his forehead to hers. "Good morning," he said, as if the phrase had been minted anew. They learned the kitchen together. He reached for the kettle. She found the tea. He attempted eggs with the grave focus of a surgeon. They came out humble, but earnest. When the toast burned, both laughed in the small way that tells a room it will be forgiven. In that fragile brightness, the world seemed practicable. 2 mugs, a plate of apricots, silence that moved around them like generous weather. Then the phone on the counter shivered. A text. Board call at 9. Victoria suggests you be on. Donor updates. Another followed. Press asked about the gala photos. A third arrived without words, only a link to a society column already uploaded in the metallic hour between night and morning. Dr. Blake's new muse? Naomi saw her own face reflected in miniature on the black glass, blurred, appropriated, captioned by hands that had never touched a book spine or a child's paper crown. She set her cup down carefully, as if noise might break the day. You should take it, she said. I don't want to, he answered, unguarded. And then, because wanting is not the same as living, he added, I will. He stepped into the small office off the kitchen, door ajar. The call filled the loft with a committee's weather, polite thunder, practiced sunlight. Ethan's tone stayed even. Yes, he'd joined the noon briefing. No, he wasn't inclined to comment on his personal life. Yes, the clinic outcomes were still tracking above projections. Yes, the expansion study would be ready for the Foundation's spring meeting. Naomi moved through the rooms without sound, straightening nothing, touching nothing, learning with her body where the corners were. When he returned, the carefulness sat on his shoulders like a jacket he hadn't chosen. I'm sorry, he said, meaning for the intrusion, for the column, for the world's habit of narrating strangers. You're not responsible for other people's italics, she replied, smiling thinner than she felt. I'm okay. Are you? The headache announced itself the way summer storms do. First a prickle, then a bruise of light at the edge of vision. She recognized the aura as it unrolled, quiet and inevitable. I will be, she said, closing her eyes. It's minor. He was beside her instantly, not fussing, not helpless, simply present. A man who had learned that attention is sometimes the cleanest medicine. Sit, he said softly. Breathe with me. He drew the curtains halfway to temper the glass. They matched their counts. 4 in, 6 out. The pain did not disappear, but its voice softened from verdict to opinion. Better? He asked. Better. They ate what the morning would allow. He reached for a grapefruit. She peeled it, the rind releasing its quiet brightness. He kissed the soft inside of her wrist with the gratitude of a pilgrim who has found a well. For a moment, the noisy world went respectful. The door intercom startled them both. Ethan pressed the button. The concierge's voice rose, contrite. Dr. Blake, Ms. Blake is here. She said it's urgent. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to Naomi with a steadiness he had earned. We don't have to do this now. We might as well learn the room we live in, she said. He nodded and buzzed the door. Victoria entered with the weather of an expensive storm. Perfume disciplined, heels conversant with marble. In daylight, she was even more precise than she'd been at the museum. Navy coat, hair immaculate, a restraint that had nothing to do with kindness. She took in the loft the way a surveyor takes in a lot. Dimensions first, then value. Her gaze reached Naomi last, the pause calibrated to register as consideration rather than judgment. Good morning, Victoria said. I started to call, but some conversations ask for shoes. Coffee, Ethan offered, ritual as armor. No, thank you. She turned to Naomi with an elegant smile that could pass any inspection. You looked beautiful last night. Thank you, Naomi said, because grace is sometimes agreeing to the sentence while refusing the footnote. Victoria folded her gloves once, twice. The Foundation's donors noticed you. The phrasing was a velvet glove. The hand inside was ledger. Their curiosity is understandable. I'm not an entry in your annual report, Ethan said mildly. You are a pillar, she corrected, not unkindly. Pillars are inspected. Then, to Naomi, this is not a reprimand. It's a reality. Rooms like last night's are built on narratives. We all must mind which ones we feed. Naomi inclined her head. I prefer to feed the ones that keep children reading and clinics open, she said. But I do understand rooms. Something flickered again. Respect, or a note made for later. Victoria set her gloves on the counter, as if laying down a scalpel. We have the spring giving drive, she said. People read the society page. They make associations. I would rather they associate my son with medicine than with romance. Romance, Ethan repeated, tone neutral as a blade. Not scandal, then. Progress. Victoria's sigh was almost fond. Don't be theatrical, darling. I'm trying to help you think strategically. Naomi felt the aura fade in the clean grip of her breath. She stood a little straighter. Strategic thinking is a specialty in libraries, she said. We place the right book on the end cap and watch a life change. Ethan and I are not an end cap. We're people who had breakfast and burned the toast. Silence met the sentence. Then, to Naomi's surprise, the faintest smile tugged at the corner of Victoria's mouth before she disciplined it. You're quick, she conceded. That is unexpected. Ethan stepped closer to Naomi, not touching, simply reducing the space where misinterpretation might breed. Mother, he said, voice conversational. I transferred Naomi's care last week. We are not crossing lines. We are naming them and staying on the right side. That's wise, Victoria said, and somehow made the words sound like barely adequate. Still, the foundation will be sensitive. We should craft a message. Or, Ethan said, we could craft a clinic day where donors meet patients who can now walk to school without falling. Both, Victoria replied smoothly. We live in a world that requires and. She looked at Naomi again. I was 23 when I entered rooms like last night's. I mistook their applause for approval. It took me a decade to learn the difference. You would be smart to learn it sooner. Approval is a moving door, Naomi said. I prefer hinges I can oil myself. Victoria's gaze held hers a beat longer. Be careful, she said softly, and in the tone Naomi heard what lay beneath satin. Love, sharpened into strategy by years of weather. Both of you. She collected her gloves and left a card on the counter. A luncheon, a board contact, an invitation or an audit. The elevator carried her away. The loft refilled with its ordinary light. The silence that followed was not empty. It hummed with their respective pulses, the day deciding whether to be damaged. Ethan set both hands on the counter, bowing his head as if to a low doorway. I hate that you were made to feel like a headline, he said. I don't feel like a headline, Naomi answered. I feel like a person trying to keep ink off a dress. They laughed, relief finding them by an unmarked road. Then, because the truth is often a sequence rather than a pronouncement, Naomi reached for his hand. We can be a we, she said, without letting the room name us first. He threaded their fingers. We can. Outside, the morning finished opening. The city found its volume. The window, honest, obedient, held. If a hairline fracture had appeared in the glass, it did not spread. It simply reminded them that clarity costs care. Ethan kissed her temple with the quiet exactness of a vow. Somewhere below, a siren rose and then, hearing itself, softened. The day proceeded, not unbroken, but continuous, strong enough, for now, to keep its shape. The restaurant chose quiet, the way cathedrals choose echo. A winter sun leaned through tall panes and laid pale gold along the linen. A vase of camellias kept their porcelain poise at the table's center. Victoria had selected the private room off the main dining hall. High ceilings, a painting of a river pretending calm, a door that closed with the tact of old money. Naomi arrived first with the particular steadiness she wore to difficult rooms. She had chosen a deep green dress that refused apology and a coat that fit like a final sentence. A maitre d' seated her with deference fine as dust. When Ethan entered moments later, relief brushed his features and rearranged them into something gentler. He touched the back of Naomi's chair. Only that, a note of width. Victoria swept in on the minute, punctuality as policy. She wore dove gray and pearls that could finance a wing. Behind her came Judge Thomas Blake, his gravitas softened by a grandfather's warmth, a man who spoke in rulings at work and in weather reports at home. Naomi, Victoria said, offering both syllables the way one offers a glass. Measured, unspilled. Ethan, thank you for coming. Of course, Ethan replied, as the waiter poured water that caught the light like delicate glass. Small talk audition briefly. The museum's new installation. A thaw predicted for Thursday. A patient's recovery that made the news. The first course arrived, saffron and porcelain. elegance that made hunger feel gauche. When the plates were cleared, Victoria placed her hands on the linen, fingers steepled as if in prayer or architecture. "I'm going to speak plainly," she said. "Good," Naomi answered softly. "It saves everyone time." A fleeting acknowledgement passed through Victoria's eyes. "The Foundation's spring campaign begins in 6 weeks. Our principal donor is wavering. He is fond of narratives, and he has chosen one that concerns you." She inclined her head toward Naomi. "And my son." Judge Blake cleared his throat, a prelude that softened nothing. "He prefers predictability," he said, a kinder synonym for control. Victoria's voice remained civilized. "If Ethan continues a public romance in this season, we risk losing an 8-figure commitment. That money extends the clinic's reach, funds residencies, pays for research that protects women's lives. These are not abstractions. They are beds and salaries and scalpel lights." Naomi folded her napkin once, keeping her hands busy so her words could be still. "And the story you prefer," she said, "is that your son remains unencumbered until the ink dries." "The story I prefer," Victoria replied, "is one in which you are not used to damage the work you both value." Ethan's jaws shifted as if choosing between a dozen sentences. He selected one with no flourish. "Mother, I will not turn my life into a campaign strategy." "You already have," she returned, not unkindly. "You have chosen to live as if your heart is a private asset. It isn't. Not when your name underwrites a dozen programs. You may dislike this truth. It remains." Judge Blake's gaze moved to Naomi, steady but not cruel. "We have both fought long to build institutions that outlast us. You may think us hard. We are simply commemorating the cost." Naomi felt the headache press at a distance, a weather front holding offshore. "What specifically are you asking?" she said. Victoria did not blink. "Postpone. Step back from the public part of this relationship until the pledge is signed. Appear alone at events. Offer a statement about focusing on the work. Keep, whatever this is, private." Naomi drew a slow breath. "You are asking me to be a shadow that looks like consideration." "I am asking you to help us keep the doors open," Victoria said. "A year from now, we can have a very different conversation." Ethan's hand found the table edge. His fingers pressed it as if safety depended on an object holding firm. "No," he said. The word landed without spectacle and seemed larger for its restraint. "I will not hang my personal life behind a curtain to buy a pledge. We will find another way." "And if you don't?" Victoria asked, not triumphant, not even expectant, merely practical. "Then I will build a smaller house and make it hospitable," he said, "but I will not sell the door." Silence carried its plates away. Outside the window, a bicyclist coasted downhill, scarf lifted like a small flag. The waiter refilled water as if devotion could be measured in ounces. Judge Blake turned his cup in the saucer, ceramic whispering against porcelain. "Ethan," he said, voice low, the timbre of a man who had learned the difference between stubbornness and spine. "The work is a covenant. Your mother can sound like Ledger because she counts the candles, but the vow is real. Do not despise the arithmetic, even as you refuse to let it own your breath." "I don't despise it," Ethan answered. "I refuse to weaponize it." Victoria's mouth softened despite herself. "You have your father's diction when you are determined." She shifted her attention to Naomi, and for the first time the polished surface thinned. "I do not dislike you," she said quietly. "I see you. I see what you bring him, this steadier light, this refusal to posture." She inhaled as if the air too were an argument. "I am asking you to consider the hundreds of names on a clinic schedule. Sometimes love must bow for a season so that other people can stand." Naomi felt the sentence enter her like a delicate blade, true in its arithmetic, suspect in its theology. She set her napkin down with care. "I will not be a secret to make a stranger comfortable," she said, "but I will not be the reason a woman walks back out into heat without an appointment. If this money cannot bear the sight of a librarian at my partner's side, perhaps it is not the kind that builds anything worth sheltering in." Judge Blake's eyes warmed, the way a judge's eyes might when a witness refuses drama and chooses diction. Victoria's gaze did not soften, but it steadied, which is sometimes the more honest mercy. "So that is your answer," she said. "That is ours. Ethan replied. Victoria lifted her glass, not to drink, but as if an acknowledgement of a ruling entered into the record. Very well, she said. We will proceed without the pledge. We will shore other walls. We will call in smaller promises and treat them as the currency they are. And if the clinic falters, if residents leave, if the study stalls, know that you have made a choice you may one day regret. Or honor, Ethan said. Or honor, she conceded, a rare concession that sounded as if it had been paid for. She stood. Judge Blake followed, nodding to Naomi with unfeigned courtesy. At the door, Victoria paused. You mistake me if you think I am only the keeper of funds, she said, not turning back. I am the mother of a son who was born with more light than makes a person safe. I have spent his life trying to ensure the world does not spend it all at once. I will not apologize for learning to shade. She glanced over her shoulder, and for the first time since the museum, her composure let slip a single human thread. Be careful with my boy. The door closed behind them with its noiseless wealth. The room exhaled. For a while, neither Naomi nor Ethan spoke. The winter sun shifted along the linen and made a clean margin. Finally, Naomi reached across the table and turned her palm up. He set his hand in it like a man placing an instrument back in its case after a performance that mattered. I won't let you be a ledger entry, he said. And I won't let you build a smaller house alone, she answered. If walls must be moved, I can carry bricks. He smiled then, not bravely, simply, and with relief, because suddenly the future looked less like a corridor and more like a room that could be furnished. Outside, a bus sighed and took on strangers who would never know the arithmetic decided here. Inside, the camellias kept their quiet porcelain, as if flowers had always known the precise difference between bending and breaking. Ethan lifted Naomi's hand and kissed the center of her palm, a notary's seal, not a spectacle. They stepped back into daylight that had apparently made up its mind. The city did not applaud or jeer. The streets simply opened, as streets do, and waited for their feet. The day after the luncheon, Atlanta woke with a rumor on its tongue. Naomi arrived at the library before the doors unlocked and found a small storm waiting in the inbox. A polite note from the director about visibility. A message from a parent asking whether storytime would remain neutral. 2 anonymous lines that smelled like smoke and said nothing worth keeping. She deleted what needed deleting, printed coloring sheets of foxes in scarves, and set out cushions as if order could convince the air to be kind. By 10, the children had gathered like a chorus of softened bells. Naomi gave them a dragon with an umbrella and a mouse who learned the weather's real name. They laughed in the right places, and the world behaved. But when storytime ended, Mrs. Callahan from the PTA waited at the edge of the rug, kindness stacked carefully, a trembling tower. You know I adore what you do, she began, hands folded around a clutch she didn't need. The trustees are nervous. Reporters called. Would you consider a short, quiet, a few weeks, until everything calms? We want to protect you, of course, and the program. Protect, Naomi thought. How that word could be a blanket or a curtain, depending on who held it. She helped a toddler into his jacket and kept her voice warm. I understand, she said, and she did. The arithmetic of small institutions that survive on goodwill and paper cuts. I'll take some leave. After Mrs. Callahan left, Naomi returned the cushions to their shelf and felt a stillness approach that did not ask permission. She went to her desk and wrote a letter with a pen that behaved. Ethan, the library needs a hush. I can't give it now. I'll visit my grandmother on the coast and let the noise run in circles until it forgets my name. This isn't a door closing. It's a window opening somewhere quieter. I don't know how long. I only know I need to hear my own feet for a few days without echo. Do the work. I'll keep a light on. And she sealed the envelope as if it were a tiny boat and walked it to the post, though she knew the mail would be slower than the pulse that carried news between 2 people. Then she went home to her apartment, the one she had nearly forgotten how to enter, the way long-held rooms reject the new key for a second before accepting it. She packed without theater, 2 dresses, the soft sweater that kept its promises, the sketchbook with a ribbon around it, the tin of watercolor moons, the book with the page that carried her grandmother's grocery list from years ago, milk, nutmeg, patience. She watered the fern. She left a glass in the sink to remind the room it was still a home. Late afternoon, the rain returned, thin and even like a good idea. Naomi took the bus to the station, because trains have always felt more honest than planes. A line you can watch leave. A path the earth agrees to hold. In the terminal, everything smelled like coffee spilled long ago. She found a bench beneath a departure board that ticked without apology and waited with her hands folded around a paper ticket as if it were a soft-boned bird. He found her by instinct, not information. When Ethan stepped into the station, the fluorescent lights made his carefulness look stern until he saw her. Then it softened into the expression a person wears when the map finally tells the truth. "I read your note," he said, breathless from no sprint anyone could see. "I didn't want it to be a letter. I wanted—" He stopped, unwilling to ask that the world be simpler than it is. She gestured to the place beside her. He sat, leaving a sliver of air where tenderness could learn geometry. The board above them flickered. Savannah, on time. "I'm not leaving you," she said before he could drag the words through worse weather. "I'm leaving the noise. The library needs me to be somewhere else for a minute, and I need to learn the size of my quiet again." He nodded, jaw working as if trying out several confessions and finding only one fit. "I should come." "You should stay," she answered, gentle, the way a palm steadies a man who has already decided to stand. "You have a clinic to build and walls to move. I won't be your alibi for saying no to rooms you should enter." "You are not an alibi," he said, heat under control. "You are the reason rooms make sense." She smiled because it was true, and because truth sometimes needs to be met with softness. "Then let me make this make sense too. I'll sit on a porch that remembers my name and draw cities where people always find each other anyway. You'll meet with donors who don't need a society page to teach them how to be generous. In a week, maybe 2, we will lay our notes on the same table and read them out loud." "A week," he said, testing the word like a bridge plank. "2 if necessary." "If necessary," she echoed. A whistle rose from somewhere honest. The train slid onto the platform and exhaled with the patience of an old animal. People stood. Luggage made its small, loyal grumbles. "I hate that it looks like retreat," he said, as if the station might publish the assumptions of strangers. "It's reconnaissance," she said. "I'm going ahead to see where the land rises and where it floods." She lifted a hand to his cheek, her palm learning again the planes it trusted. "And if you need me before the week is done, if the arithmetic becomes a weapon, or the glass remembers it's breakable, call. I'll come back on the next train with a hammer or a lullaby, whatever the day asks." He took her wrist and turned it, pressing his mouth to the place where pulse admits its effort. "I don't want to let you go." "You aren't," she said. "You're letting me make a circle that brings me back." They stood with the unison, awkward grace of people who have not rehearsed goodbye. He didn't reach for her hand. He reached for the strap of her bag and adjusted it as if weight could be carried by love in public. Then, the smallest nod, the smallest step forward, the kiss the night had taught them how to keep true. It was not a plea. It was a charter. "Draw something for me," he said against her mouth, a smile in the request. "I already have," she replied. "A bridge with room for weather." "All right." He inhaled once, steadied something invisible and stepped back. "Go." She climbed the metal stairs, the ticket becoming function in the conductor's hand. At the carriage door, she turned. He lifted a hand, not a wave, a raised lantern. She raised her own, the answer a lighthouse gives a ship. The train accepted her. The door sighed shut. As it pulled away, the city telescoped, the station's arches, the street beyond where a woman hurried with a bouquet, the slice of sky that had chosen gray. Naomi found a seat by the window and set her sketchbook on her lap. The pencil drew its own weather. A long pane of glass watched by 2 silhouettes, a porch with a blue ceiling, a coil of coastline like a listening ear. She labeled none of it. She didn't have to. Some images keep their own legend. Back in the station, Ethan remained until the board replaced Savannah with the next promise leaving. He tucked his hands into his pockets, not to keep them from shaking, but to keep them from breaking the air. Then he turned with the practiced humility of a man returning to work after knowing something beautiful. and walked out into the afternoon. Rain began again, unassuming, fair. He headed toward the hospital with a quieter gait, the kind that makes long corridors shorter. In his pocket, his phone buzzed. A text from Sharon. The art hour loved the crowns. Saturday again? Another from Dr. Shah. Naomi's update. Headaches trending down. Good signs. A third, a number he didn't recognize. Heard the donor balked. We should talk. Some of us give for reasons that never fit in a column. He stopped under an awning to read that last one twice. The sky darkened obligingly, and then offered a reluctant blue along the edge of a cloud. In the train window, Naomi watched water tuck itself into fields and then unspool. Pine gave way to marsh. The air changed vowels. Her grandmother's house would smell like tide water and soap, and on the back steps there would be a chipped bowl for stray cats, and a broom that remembered every argument it had ever settled with the porch. She closed her eyes and let the past and the future sit, one on either side, like patient relatives waiting for the kettle to boil. She would return. The decision was not a coin tossed to fate. It was a sentence written in ink that did not fear rain. But for now the track held true. The car hummed a soft metal hymn, and her heart beat the math of leaving in order to learn how to stay. The coast received Naomi the way a hymn receives breath, softly, with room. Her grandmother's cottage crouched among live oaks, their arms layered with old lace. The porch ceiling was the color of a kind sky. A blue glass bottle on the railing held sunlight like a memory. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and tide, and the clock in the hallway kept time in a kindly way, as though it had learned the difference between late and held. Naomi set her bag down and sat at the kitchen table, where so many letters had been written and none had lied. She brewed tea in the chipped white pot that made everything taste like forgiveness, and opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. The line that came was not a city and not a bridge. It was a pair of hands, palms up, with a slim thread running from one to the other, as if the world had finally shown its simplest machine. On the second morning, she walked the beach at low tide, where the water had briefly remembered how to be a mirror. Pelicans folded and unfolded their clumsy grace. A boy ran along the lip of foam, leaving proofs of his speed that the sea erased with professional courtesy. Naomi wrote lines on the wind and let them go. By afternoon, she had a handful of postcards addressed to no one, sentences about light and small repairs, and how quiet is not the absence of sound but the presence of patience. Back in Atlanta, the corridors grew a different weather. Ethan spent his days between rounds and rooms, where chairs were arranged for persuasion. He shaved the arguments down to what would hold: outcomes, access, measurable mercy. He told the truth without theater. People listened, then asked for reassurance that cost less than courage. On Wednesday, the foundation convened an emergency forum: donors, residents, 3 current patients whose names were their own, and none of the audience's business. Victoria presided with the calm of an ice skater who knows the lake. Judge Blake sat 2 chairs away, hands folded like a prayer that knew when to stop asking. Ethan rose when called, and did not touch the microphone as if it were dangerous. "The clinic exists," he said, "because a city can be convinced to love its strangers." He looked at faces that had learned to hide their weather and gave them his. "We can argue about optics until the year forgets us, or we can talk about Dora, who walked into our Tuesday with a blood pressure that would have made Wednesday leave, and walked out able to laugh. We can talk about Malik's insulin, or Lula's referral, or the resident who stopped thinking underserved was a synonym for unreachable. We can talk about cost per miracle, if that suits the ledger. The price is still a bargain." A ripple of warmth passed through the room, and then, bumping up against the cold grammar of money, broke. The principal donor cleared his throat, waiting for the air to find him. "I admire your conviction, doctor," he said, giving the word the value of a coin. "But institutions prefer stability. They cannot be built on romance." "Then build them on promise," Ethan replied. "Leave me out of your cautionary tale and consider the data you were given." It should have ended there. Caution keeps doors cracked to let drafts in. But a woman at the back, gray braid, posture like a lighthouse, stood. "I'm a school nurse," she said. "The clinic caught my girls before the ground did. I give a widow's tithe, And I want it spent on rooms where men like this can say the word love without the lights flickering. A young surgeon raised a hand. I'm gay, he said. I don't like my bosses pretending their lives are sterile, so the brochure feels clean. Fund the outcomes. Leave people's hearts alone. Laughter, a little ragged, a little brave. Victoria's face did not change. If anything, the line of her mouth grew more precise, as if she were using a sharper tool to carve a more honorable figure. When the vote came, the principal pledge walked out wearing the scent of his own rectitude. But half a dozen smaller checks found their pens. A woman in a floral dress pressed a crumpled envelope into the COO's hand with the apology of the poor and the pride of the saved. And, quietly, the Morrison Foundation emailed that evening. Let's talk tomorrow. Your numbers move us. So does the way you held your line. That night, Ethan drove without destination until the interstate turned into a ribbon of low notes. He pulled into a rest area where grass insisted on its green and called Naomi. The phone carried her hello like a lantern in fog. Tell me something true, she said. We lost the big check, he answered, and then, because truth without proportion is a kind of lie, and found 5 smaller ones. It will be harder. It will also be cleaner. I needed you to say that, she murmured. I needed to know your hands were still empty of bargains. They are, he waited. Tell me where you are. On the back steps, she said. The porch is full of voices that have nothing to prove. The ocean is practicing its long mathematics. The cats are pretending they don't believe in love and failing at it. He laughed, a sound with room in it. I miss you. I miss you too, but I needed the map to quiet down. Come home when it has, he said, not before. The next day, Naomi's grandmother, Etta, small and sovereign, patted the cushion beside her on the couch and began sorting a basket of buttons that had outlived several generations of coats. Men like your Ethan, she said without preamble, are raised to make sense. If they are lucky, they fall in love with women raised to make meaning. She held up a navy button as if it were a coin. Sense will get you fed. Meaning will keep you from swallowing your own tongue. Naomi laughed, despite the sudden prick of tears. Did you make that up just now? Child, I've been alive since radio was a miracle. None of my wisdom is new. Etta poured the buttons from palm to palm. Don't hide long. Silence, left alone too long, rots. Tell that boy the kind of quiet you intend to keep. That evening, Naomi sat at the kitchen table and wrote with the steadiness a person finds only after walking a beach where the tide confesses. I do not want a life built on apologies to rooms I do not love. I want the kind of work that stands when we do, and sits when asked, and does not require us to whisper about breakfast. If our love asks the clinic to be honest, let it. If the clinic asks our love to be brave, let it. I will be home on Sunday with an extra pair of hands and a pie that refuses to be modest. She did not send the letter. She folded it into her coat pocket like a pledge that preferred cloth to cloud. Back in the city, Victoria visited the clinic on a day when rain drew straight lines. She arrived without entourage and asked for a tour. A nurse showed her the vaccination room with its cartoon decals lifting the corners of fear. An interpreter introduced her to a mother whose gratitude needed translating, only because gratitude does not like to perform for strangers. In the hallway, Victoria paused before a bulletin board covered in crayon. Dragons with flu shots, crowns under stethoscopes, one drawing of a bridge. Who did that? She asked, touching the corner with a fingertip that could have been a caress. Volunteer from the library, the nurse said. She's away for a week. Comes on Saturdays. The kids behave better when she's here. The paper listens to her. Victoria said nothing for a long time. When she left, no statement followed her. But that evening she sat at her desk and wrote a note on her private stationery to a name she had never used in ink. Naomi, your drawings are persuasive without argument. I don't like losing money. I like losing my certainty less. V. Friday brought the Morrison meeting. Cautious enthusiasm. Then, for reasons both empirical and beautifully human, a commitment that, combined with the smaller gifts, made the clinic's springs secure. Ethan walked out into the pale noon and did not exhale like a victor. He exhaled like a man who had placed his stone on the right side of the scale and found the beam honest. On the coast, Saturday fell like a blessing. Naomi painted her grandmother's hands around a ceramic mug and left the picture on the sill to dry. She packed at dusk, the marsh turning the color of a bruise that had remembered it was also a jewel. As she zipped her bag, the letter in her pocket warmed against her like a kept promise. Sunday morning, a train took up the sentence she had put down days before and finished it with dignity. Naomi sat by the window. A man in the seat across from her slept with his mouth open, and no shame. A child traded crackers for a sticker and called it commerce. She drew the skyline in 5 strokes she did not have to correct. When she stepped into the station, Ethan was already there, not performing a rival, simply part of the room that had expected her. They stood, an arm's length apart, and let the undertow of longing recede until it was safe to move. Then she crossed the space between them and placed her palm flat against his chest, the way you do when you check a truth that requires anatomy. "I choose this," she said, not a declaration, a record. "So do I," he answered, even when the arithmetic scolds. Especially then. She slipped the letter from her pocket and put it in his hand. "Read later. It says we will not become a footnote. It says I made a pie. It says I am home." He did not kiss her because the station was full of strangers who had not earned the spectacle. He took her bag, and with his other hand he offered his palm. She placed hers in it, every finger a small vow. They walked out into a morning that had decided to be bright, and the city, having heard their reckoning, adjusted its light without complaint. The spring that followed carried a patient kind of light, the sort that does not announce itself but lingers in doorways, waiting to be invited in. Naomi's return to Atlanta slipped into the rhythm of things with a grace that surprised her. Perhaps love, when it endures its first winter, comes back not louder but truer. The library welcomed her with the scent of glue and old pages, a steady pulse of children's laughter returning to their own narrative. On her desk, a folded card waited, a drawing in crayon, signed by 6 names she recognized from the hospital art program. Above their shaky letters, a green dragon blew bubbles instead of fire. Beneath it, Sharon had written, "The art hour misses your steady hands." Naomi smiled, the sort of smile that pulls gently at the corners of fatigue and turns it into belonging. Across the city, the clinic hummed with cautious expansion. New volunteers had arrived, young doctors drawn by the peculiar alchemy of purpose and stubborn hope. The funding secured from the Morrison Foundation had turned into real work, renovated exam rooms, equipment that no longer coughed before starting. And in a quiet corner, on the wall beside the pediatric waiting area, Ethan had hung one of Naomi's watercolor bridges, matted and framed in oak. Underneath, a small brass plaque read, "Drawn by the hands that believe healing can be taught." When Naomi saw it for the first time, she didn't speak. She stood in front of it, feeling the subtle shiver of recognition that happens when art returns home, disguised as grace. Ethan came up behind her, the faint scent of soap and paper on his skin. "I didn't ask," he said softly. "I hoped." She turned toward him, eyes still on the painting. "You gave it a name," she whispered. "That's the first rule of love in libraries. Never let a thing go unnamed." Their days folded into something close to rhythm. Naomi taught story time again, but now her sessions carried echoes of the clinic, the same soft authority she'd learned among hospital beds. She wrote new stories too, a picture book called "The Boy Who Brought the Rain Inside," about courage mistaken for trouble. An editor from a small press found her through Sharon's cousin and sent a letter that began with, "Your words made me remember the first time I wasn't afraid to be seen." It became the kind of letter one keeps in a drawer for days when quiet turns sharp. Ethan, meanwhile, began to unlearn his own perfection. He stopped measuring every outcome against what could have gone wrong and started counting instead what had gone right. The children who came to his clinic drew crowns for him now, scrawled across prescription pads and scraps of gauze. His colleagues teased him for the drawings tacked to his bulletin board, but none of them failed to notice that his voice, even in crisis, had found a gentler gravity. Sometimes they met for lunch at the cafe where everything had started, the one with the cracked tile under the corner table and the shortbread moons. The waitress knew their order by heart: 2 teas, 1 honey, 1 plain. They didn't talk about the column that had once defined them, or the donors who still whispered their story in boardrooms. Instead, they spoke of smaller things: the texture of a child's laugh, the stubborn beauty of living where expectation and tenderness overlap. On weekends, they drove to the edge of the Chattahoochee, to the narrow trail that wound beneath cypress and sweet gum. There, conversation thinned to the essentials: breath, heartbeat, hand. Naomi painted from the trunk of Ethan's car, the watercolor tin balanced on her knees. He read aloud from books he'd never had time for: Baldwin, Wolfe, a collection of Neruda translated by a man who believed even sorrow deserved rhythm. It wasn't a life without edges. It was one that knew how to soften them. One afternoon, near the end of April, Naomi hosted a joint reading and art show at the library. The exhibit featured works from the children of the clinic's art hour: dragons with dental braces, nurses in superhero capes, doctors drawn with capes of their own. Ethan stood near the back, watching her move through the crowd with her hands clasped behind her back like a teacher among stars she'd helped hang. When she reached him, the applause had just begun. A quiet, human sound of people who knew what it meant to keep showing up. He leaned close enough for his breath to warm the curve of her ear. "They're proud of you," he said. "I'm proud of them," she answered, gesturing toward the small faces watching their own art shine. "They remind me how stories grow roots where no one expects them." Later, as the crowd thinned and the janitor dimmed the overheads, Naomi noticed Victoria standing near the doorway. For a moment, she thought she had imagined her. There was no entourage, no polished detachment. Only a woman holding a paper program folded twice, as if it might bruise. "I wanted to see it," Victoria said, stepping closer. "The drawings, the bridge." Naomi's reply came gentle. "It's stronger than it looks." "I believe you," Victoria said. Then, after a pause, "You should know, the clinic's new mentorship fund came through. An anonymous gift." Her tone carried the faintest irony, like light catching glass. The donor asked that it be named the Ellis Initiative. Naomi felt the air catch behind her ribs. "That's generous." "It's overdue," Victoria said simply, then added, "I was wrong about what people can bear. About what love costs and what it builds. Sometimes it adds wings to the roof instead of cracks in the walls." The older woman touched Naomi's arm, a fleeting, human gesture, and left before the moment could harden into sentiment. That night, Naomi and Ethan walked home under a moon bright enough to unmake mistakes. He slipped his fingers through hers, and together they spoke of the future, not as plan but as practice. Her next story, his new residence, the possibility of a community garden behind the clinic, where children could grow what they'd once only drawn. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that we had to lose a little dignity to find the right kind of peace?" "I think dignity is overrated," he said. "I prefer grace. It bends better." She smiled. "Then we'll build with that." In the months that followed, the city seemed to conspire with them. The library's story time expanded into workshops at the clinic. The hospital's roof garden bloomed under the hands of patients and staff. At home, their apartment filled with art, sketches of hands, letters from children, blueprints of bridges that had long since crossed into metaphor. On the first day of summer, Naomi woke before dawn. Ethan still slept beside her, his breath even and unafraid. She moved to the window and looked out at the city, bathed in that rare hour when everything seems both young and forgiven. On her desk lay a page from her newest story. "The bridge is not made of steel or stone. It's made of names, whispered over and over until they remember each other." She smiled, picked up her pen, and began again. The story, after all, was still being built. The city learned a kinder tempo. Not suddenly, not with fanfare, more like a metronome nudged half a click toward mercy. Buses still sighed at corners, trains still stitched their low silver lines across morning, and clocks continued their patient arithmetic. Yet between the numbers, something softer took root. If you stood in the doorway of the library at opening time, you could hear it. The hush before the first hello, the small bravery of children setting their backpacks down like flags. If you waited in the clinic's hallway at dusk, you could hear it too. Monitors exhaling, shoes whispering home, the grateful quiet of bodies that had been seen. Naomi began to measure life by those intervals, the little rooms of silence that hold two people long enough to tell the truth. She wrote a book about them, though she called it A Story for Children. The Girl Who Counted the Wind. It was really about listening. On the dedication page she wrote, "For the ones who leave space so love can speak." When the book arrived, slim and blue as a river under moonlight, she placed the first copy on the clinic's shelf and the second on the library's, then slid a third into an envelope addressed to Victoria Blake. No note, just a return address in her careful hand. The garden behind the clinic took its first summer like a promise. Volunteers turned soil that had been an afterthought. Children planted marigolds and tomatoes with the solemn authority of new citizens. Ethan learned to water in the evening, sleeves rolled, ties surrendered. The day's precision traded for humility before bugs and weather. When the cherry tomatoes ripened, a boy presented Ethan with two, palms open as if offering a sacrament. Ethan split one, gave half back, and bit his share as if the world had improved its recipe for sweetness. They did not marry that year. Some stories end that way. Theirs chose a wider river. They practiced vows in ordinary grammar. I will boil the kettle. I will leave the porch light on. I will tell you when the room is too loud and I need to step outside. They bought a second-hand table with a scratch shaped like lightning and declared it beautiful. They brought home a stray calico who refused every name until she answered to Harbor. They learned each other's winter, how fatigue arranges furniture, how fear disguises itself as carefulness. And they wrote instructions on the inside of their hands so they would not forget. Sometimes, late, they climbed the hospital's roof with permission and sat near the camellias listening to the city breathe. Ethan would point to the windows where the night glowed stubbornly and say, "A life is happening there." And Naomi would nod, then sketch the light as if she were catching fireflies for a jar. Other nights, he would take the cello from its stand, draw out a single note, and they would hold their breath to see how far the sound could travel before it turned into something else. It never went far. It didn't need to. The space between heartbeats was wide enough. In autumn, Naomi's grandmother sent a package wrapped in brown paper and stubborn string. Inside, a quilt of old blouses and two worn shirts that once belonged to no one Ethan knew. The letter said, "Every house needs one warm decision." They spread it across the bed and slept better under its history. At the next winter gala, the bridge at the museum gleamed as always, but the room below had learned new manners. There were still people who preferred their stories ironed and folded. There always will be. Yet when Naomi and Ethan crossed the span, the light did not tremble, and no headline arrived to translate them against their will. Victoria met them near the sketch gallery and touched the watercolor on the wall with two fingers, as if confirming the pulse of a word. "It holds," she said quietly. "Bridges do," Naomi answered, and a small, unborrowed peace settled between them. Imperfect, workable, like a truce that plans to ripen into trust. Spring brought other changes they had not planned, but welcomed with the awe ordinary days deserve. One morning, Naomi placed Ethan's hand against her belly and waited, eyes wide as a first night in a new city. He felt it, the faint wing beat, the secret rehearsal, and laughed the laugh that only happens when joy arrives shy and undeniable. They told almost no one at first, not for fear but for reverence. The world would have its turn. For a while, the news belonged to the space between their breaths. The clinic's garden learned new hands. The library added a second story hour because the first had become a festival. Letters kept arriving, some with checks, some with drawings, some with a sentence that always began the same way. "I thought I was alone until..." Naomi answered everyone she could, sometimes with ink, sometimes with a crown cut from yellow paper, sometimes with a watercolor bridge small enough to tuck inside a wallet. On a late summer evening, they walked to the river as the sky practiced its slow dimming. Fireflies stitched patient green commas into the dark. Ethan carried a thermos. Naomi carried her sketchbook, and the certainty that their lives, stitched from careful choices, repaired after rips, hemmed with humor, were strong enough to hold the weather they wanted. They sat on the bank until the night decided to tell secrets. When they stood to go, she pressed her ear to his chest and counted, not to test him, but to hear the truth. There it was, steady as a vow, stubborn as love. generous as a porch light on a street that pretends not to need it. If you asked them later how it all began, they would say, with a door gently opened, a window left ajar, a room that learned not to punish silence. If you asked how it survived, they would say, with patience, with names, with a chorus of small kindnesses that never made the paper and always made the day. And now, if their story has laid a bridge inside you, if you have felt in these pages the hush before a hello, the rightness of a hand offered with care, the bravery of building without spectacle, come stand with us on that bright span. Tell us which moments met you. Share the heartbeat you counted. Leave a note, a thought, a small crown in the comments so others can find their way. If you'd like to keep walking with Naomi and Ethan as new chapters quietly bloom, tap like, follow, and pass this story along to someone who is ready to believe that the distance between two worlds can be crossed by listening. Somewhere, a kettle sings. Somewhere, a monitor softens its glow. Somewhere, a child lifts a crayon and draws a bridge without being told how. Between those moments, between heartbeats, love waits, not impatient, not afraid, simply certain that we will recognize it and say, yes, I am here.